Okay, well, let's get started. It's 8:30. I'm especially delighted to welcome Jeremy Greene as our speaker today. Dr. Greene is the associate professor in the Departments of Medicine and History of Medicine, where he holds the Elizabeth Trade and A. McGee Harvey Chair in the History of Medicine. Dr. Greene received his training at Harvard, both his medical degree and his doctoral research. His interests focus on the history of the pharmaceutical industry and its interactions with medical research, clinical practice, and public health. He has written a book called Prescribing by Numbers, which he's actually brought here to show people if they're interested. His current research projects involve studying the role of pharmaceutical interventions in global health, emerging problem of medication non-adherence, and the historical development and impact of pharmaceutical marketing, advertising, and salesmanship. Today he's going to talk to us about generic drugs and the use of generic drugs.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and in many ways it's been a pleasure to join the Hopkins faculty, and I'm still in the process of getting to know new colleagues in these campuses, and some of your faces I've had the pleasure of seeing before. Others of you are new, and just introduce myself to you. I'm a clinician and a historian. I'm very interested in how we know what we know about drugs, how we know what we know about therapeutics, and how those knowledges actually cross over with other ways of making and circulating knowledge, markets for knowledge, markets for good, how we consider how we understand disease and how we understand health. The work today, this is my first pass through it before a live audience. I'm trying to give you a sketch of the book project I'm currently writing, the same but not the same, A Brief History of Generic Drugs. And this work's been funded by a Scholars Award in Science, Technology, and STS from the National Science Foundation, and from a scholarly work in biomedical science from the National Library of Medicine. I'm very excited to present it. In a way, when we talk about generic drugs, part of the received mythology of generic drugs is that they are uninteresting, right? That they're mundane. No one's going to win a Nobel for discovering a generic drug. At least we don't think so. Why should a historian of science and medicine study these things? And the matter only gets worse when you look at a set of documents like these, the forms, and these are just 2 of the 13 pages of the checklist that is only the reminder to make sure you have all the correct ingredients to file the monstrous piece of paperwork that is an ANDA, an abbreviated new drug application. And the ANDA is the key gateway, the regulatory pathway by which the Food and Drug Administration approves new generic products. Now, the ANDA is a basis of approval on a basis of similarity rather than proof of efficacy and safety. And this is part of my fascination. What are proofs of similarity? What is this new world of therapeutics in which similarity rather than efficacy and safety is the key knowledge threshold? And this is a conversation I'm very interested in having with this group in particular. Now, the word generic itself, like this form, suggests the ho-hum, the general, the unmarked, the easily forgotten. A generic argument, one I hope not to make today, is one that is not particularly novel. So too we expect with generic drugs. Yet for those of us interested in studying how we know what we know about therapeutics, generics, when we look at them more closely, become an object of intrigue and fascination. And this is the thing I would hope to leave you with today, that the generic, far from being forgettable, is actually an object of intrigue and fascination. And I'm going to start with the stories of 2 people whose lives were changed dramatically by generic drugs. I'd love a show of hands to see if you know either of these people as historical figures. One is Marvin Seif. Has anyone encountered Marvin Seif before? And the other is Betty Dong. Anyone heard the story of Betty Dong? Okay, these are relevant stories, and I'll try and do them quickly as an introduction. So here's Marvin Seif. On a balmy winter's day in 1987, Seif sat down to a rather generic working lunch that would lead to the premature end of his career and almost his life. A physician who had entered service at the Food and Drug Administration in 1965, Seif worked his way up through the monograph division of the FDA to become the first head of the new division of generic drugs in the 1970s. And by all accounts, Seif was a no-frills idealist. He was decorated for decades of selfless public service. In 1986, he won the FDA Award of Merit, the highest award in the administration. But when he had lunch that day at a rather nondescript restaurant in Rockville with an executive of a little-known pharmaceutical company called MyK Laboratories, he would find the meal and meeting entirely forgettable to his great peril. The $59.20 lunch, which was recorded on the American Express card of Mackay's president, if not in the memory of Marvin Seif, resurfaced a few years later in the hands of Congressman John Dingell, a Democrat of Michigan, then chair of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation. And at that time, by 1989, generic drugs have been the subject of a great deal of bipartisan enthusiasm since the passage of the Watershed Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration of 1984, the Hatch-Waxman Act, or Waxman-Hatch Act, depending on which side of the aisle you saw it from. This act created a clear pathway for the approval of generic copies of off-patent innovative drugs through an ANDA process that was streamlined based on proof of something called bioequivalence, so showing equal absorption of a drug, similar absorption levels of a drug in serum and human volunteers. Now, the aim of this bill of Hatch-Waxman, which was praised by everyone from Ronald Reagan to Ted Kennedy, was to promote cheaper versions of existing medications as the product of a competitive new industry, a generic drug industry. As a bipartisan solution, the embrace of generic drugs was also seen as a win-win. In fact, in some ways, Hatch-Waxman is one of the most successful pieces and one of the exemplars of bipartisan legislation since the 80s. Advancement of public health and the virtue of the free market. But not everybody was convinced that the rapid growth of the generic drug industry was for the benefit of all, and Dingell found himself following up on complaints that reached his office from companies that felt they had been treated unfairly by the FDA's Division of Generic Drugs. And over the next few years, he set a set of subpoenas and hearings that would uncover what many consider to be the worst scandal in the history of the Food and Drug Administration, leading to a score of felony convictions, imprisonment, and the resignation of the FDA commissioner himself. So what happened with this scandal? Now there's particularly intrigue. I can't tell you all the details of the scandal. There's a figure known as Charlie Chang. He's an FDA regulator in the Generic Drugs Division. He's accepting overstuffed manila envelopes full of thousands of dollars of cash. They're being left in chairs and in bathrooms and things like this. Chang orchestrates a team of regulators and instructs them to lose certain correspondence while speeding through others to favor certain generic drug companies over others. And again, unlike innovative drugs, which are approved on the basis of safety and efficacy, generic drugs were approved on the basis of a proof of similarity. If they could pass a set of tests in comparison to the innovator drugs, they could get access to a market. And the first to get through would get a degree of market exclusivity. And I mentioned bioequivalence before. And one of the problems with bioequivalence testing is that the FDA's office soon found that generic drug companies themselves were not capable of doing bioequivalence testing. They were outsourcing it to other companies. And one of the premier companies they were outsourcing it to was actually based here in Baltimore. It was a company called Pharmakinetics, and it appeared to exist almost entirely to do bioequivalence testing for generic drug companies. And Dingell's committee subpoenas the entire biosample library of Pharmakinetics. And what they find is a whole house of cards of generic drugs that are claiming to be the same and actually aren't the same at all. And what I want to show you here is one example that came before Dingell's committee. This on the left is Sandoz drug Mellaril, thioridazine. And this over here is a sample sent by the generic company Bolar for testing by Pharmakinetics. And they look very similar. The profiles were actually quite similar when they did the bioequivalence testing, and Bolar got approval for marketing it. But on closer examination, and unfortunately the historical record has conspired against us here in terms of bad photocopying of this image, one could actually see in this pill the trace of a triangle and a faintly erased S. And what it became clear that Bolar had been doing was basically taking actual tablets of Mellaril, sanding off the logo, claiming it was their own product, and sending it in for testing because their own product could not in itself actually pass bioequivalence testing. And Bolar was one of many companies that were actually doing exactly this thing. And so you see the scandal that begins to emerge here. These things claim to be the same, but they're not the same. And this comes out in this nest of corruption in this institution that's headed by Seif. Now, Seif, to be fair, appears to have known almost nothing about any of this. But what gets Seif in the end is that he forgets about this lunch. And as Charlie Chang turns over a number of people, Mike Hayes' president gets subpoenaed, his Amex card record gets subpoenaed, and then this lunch that Seif had denied attending comes onto the record, and Seif is actually imprisoned for perjury. And he's supposed to be sent to a minimal security prison. Due to a clerical error, he winds up in the wrong place, a maximal security prison, with no paperwork to identify him. And he's treated like a generic prisoner, which means by standard procedure, he's put in solitary confinement until people can understand better who he is, with standard prison clothes. Now, the trouble is, medically speaking, and I'm putting on my internist hat here, Seif is not a generic prisoner. He's a brittle, insulin-dependent diabetic with avascular necrosis of both hips. Without his own shoes, he quickly develops foot ulcers. Without his insulin, he slowly slips into a diabetic coma, complicated by overwhelming infective sepsis. He's transferred eventually to a nearby ICU. He's there for over a month. He barely survives, but he loses actually multiple limbs in the process. And it's quite a terrible story what happens to Marvin Seif. I want to suggest, and the other side of the country at exactly the same time, there's another figure whose involvement with generic and brand name drugs has significant consequences for the deflection of her own life course. And as Seif is having a lunch that proves to be far from free, Betty Dong, in 1987, was a rising star in the UCSF Academic Pharmacology Department. Dong's laboratory was pioneering new forms of research into biological differences that could appear when comparing chemically equivalent versions of drugs, especially, in her case, in thyroid hormones. And now, as some of you might know, unlike simpler drugs, for example, a diuretic or an antibiotic, where all you need to do to have a drug work is to have the drug concentration in the relevant tissue get above a certain threshold, thyroid hormone only works if it's titrated at a precise therapeutic range. Too much thyroid hormone and you have these symptoms of hyperthyroidism. Too little thyroid hormone and you have symptoms of hypothyroidism. And as Dong's early research showed, it really mattered how a drug was composed, not just what chemical was in it, not just that levothyroxine was present, but exactly how it was composed in the pill. And thyroid is a bit more complicated too, because unlike other drugs which simply need to get into your stomach to get into your bloodstream and work, thyroid interacted with a lot of other entities en route from stomach to target site. So it was an object lesson in how generic drugs could be different. Thyroid hormone seemed about the best place to start as any. So it's not surprising then to Dong or to UCSF that Boots Pharmaceuticals, the makers of Synthroid, the market leader and well-established brand of levothyroxine, is interested in funding her work, and specifically interested in giving her the resources to conduct a large enough clinical trial of different generic equivalent thyroid hormone products to definitively prove that chemically equivalent thyroid preparations were in fact not actually bioequivalent in practice. So what motivates Boots at this point is partly that although Synthroid had been the market leader for a while, new competitors, particularly Lovoxyl, but also a few other competitors as well, are beginning to eat into its market by the late 1980s. And so to Dong and Boots, the contract seemed like a win-win affair. Dong would obtain funding to do a clinical study of bioequivalence that was previously impossible. Boots would obtain definitive proof of inequivalence to help defend its flagship product from market competition. And so it's not surprising, perhaps, that when Dong signed this research concentration in 1987, she didn't make note of the clauses yielding ownership of the data and publication rights to Boots. And this became a problem in mid-1990 when Dong's team first turned over its raw data to its sponsor with an unexpected response. And that response is that all 4 levothyroxine products actually performed identically. So seeking a proof of difference, Boots funded a definitive study of similarity. So what happens? So what happens is Dong's article is poised to be published in JAMA in early 1995. Boots threatens her with a breach of contract lawsuit. UCSF's lawyers fold on her. Dong, left alone, pulls the study and agrees not to publish it. In its place, Boots publishes the data in its own form as a critique of the data. It publishes the data as an example of a poorly conducted study, even though Boots had sponsored the study and been involved with the conduct of the study all along. This would have been the story, except a Wall Street Journal reporter breaks the story in early 1997. It becomes a nationwide scandal, the Betty Dong affair, or the thyroid storm, as Drummond Rennie of JAMA publishes. And JAMA publishes eventually Dong's original article. And I want to point out that to the extent that we remember the Dong affair, the thyroid storm, it becomes a story about ownership of data and about the kinds of contractual oversight that universities need to have in protecting academics. And since Dong, right, a number of researchers now know to be on the lookout for clauses that restrict ownership of data. And certainly speakers in this room have talked about this, Kathy DeAngelis most recently. But there's another way of remembering this thyroid storm, and this is a story of a science of equivalence that is suppressed by a political economy intent on perpetuating a sense of difference. And this specific role was not lost on the actors themselves, especially consumers of Synthroid and the public and private entities that paid for the drug. So there's a class action lawsuit that's launched in 1997 by public payers, another one by private payers, to try and recover some of the estimated $800 million per year in differential pricing that went because payers paid for Synthroid because there was data that suggested that Synthroid could not be substituted by Levoxyl or other levothyroxine products. And eventually, Booth's new owner, BASF, settles for over $100 million. There's a hefty sum, but it's only a mere fraction of the estimated cost gap. And Dong's career, unlike Seif's, would eventually recover. She still is on the faculty of UCSF. She does remarkable work, but she lost years of her career as a casualty of public controversies over the similarity and difference between generic and brand-name drugs. Now, this is an introduction to the book that I'm writing. I've given you two stories of individuals who have suffered materially over the equivalence or inequivalence of generic drugs. Now, nobody really comes off as a good guy in these stories. Not the generic firms, not the brand name firms, not the regulators, not the researchers. And were to stop now, it would sound merely a pessimistic forecast that all the world of therapeutics is tainted and corrupt. What I want to point out, though, is that these stories show a paradox of generic drugs that we would do well to attend more to. From opposite directions at the same moment in time, are generics really the same as brand name drugs? Are generics really different from brand name drugs? Most people who have written about this question take one side or the other side as true and the other as a false smokescreen. It becomes a contest of ideologies. And I want to suggest that we need a history, we need a way of studying this question that allows for both. It allows for generic drugs to be the same and also not the same, and for us to understand where that difference matters and where it doesn't. It's not possible for us to evaluate which is more relevant purely for the American public. Dong's problem, in which things that are really the same but are hidden behind a smokescreen of interested claim of difference, or Seif's problem, in which things that are really different are falsely stamped with a corrupt seal of government equivalence. Nevertheless, these problems become increasingly important in the therapeutic world of the late 20th century. Their importance continues to grow in the 21st. And here's just one of many documents that attest to this. This is an IMS report that came out just a couple of years ago. IMS is the market leader in market research data in the pharmaceutical industry. And in less than 50 years, generic drugs have expanded from less than 10% of the total prescription drug market to more than 80% of prescriptions filled in the U.S. By the early 21st century, generic drugs are omnipresent objects in the clinic and in the home. In most American states, a prescription written for a brand name drug will be filled generically at the pharmacy. And we like to think of these things as interchangeable. Why pay the brand name price for Lipitor, for example, when generic atorvastatin works just as well for a fraction of the price? In other words, the substitution of bioequivalent generic drugs for more expensive brand name drugs appears to be one of the few, and perhaps the only, success story in a field of otherwise failed attempts to deliver equivalent value in healthcare for a lower price. So we don't want to tear this edifice down, far from it. Yet I want to point out, this is very recent history. The generic drug we are so familiar with was a hotly contested object only a few decades ago, and not an object at all a few decades before that. The generic drug, historically speaking, is very new. In the context that we mean it, it is unique to the second half of the 20th century. And it was also illegal in most states to substitute generic drugs for brand name drugs until the 1970s. And actually, 1984 is the last year in which an anti-substitution law is taken off the books in the last state to hold on to it. So the rest of the talk, I hope I've established that we can think of a generic as a site of intrigue. I want to move quickly through these other sections in the time I have left to suggest how a history of generic drugs opens up important questions for kinds of knowledge increasingly important in contemporary health policy. When is a medicine good enough? How can we make that decision? And what are the sciences of similarity that allow us to think about that? So I'm going to start by talking about what's in a generic name, then move along to this category of things that are generic drugs, and then talk briefly about the kinds of scientific forms that emerge in trying to assess similarity and difference in the late 20th century. So what's in a name? What is a generic name? Now, as many of us know, a generic name is a third name. T.S. Eliot famously says about practical cats that that each drug actually has, each cat, or I shouldn't refer to cats as drugs. It's an interesting slip. I'm deeply allergic to them, and so they do have a physiological effect on me. So each cat has one and only one true name that is hidden, and it's their third name. And in many ways, I think of a generic name of a drug as like that. It's not the brand name, right? It's not the proprietary name. It's not the specific but entirely untenable chemical name. It's supposed to be a third thing, a public face of the drug that is useful. But as many critics have pointed out, generic names are oftentimes mouthfuls, they're jawbreakers, they are not taught, they are not encouraged through promotion. And if they are the rational name for drugs, then we are all much more vested in the irrationality of the brand. Now, the national interest in generic names, I argue, effectively begins in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, when American papers and television news carried the unusual spectacle of a Senate committee led by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver asking physicians, pharmacists, consumer groups, and the drug lobby itself whether the name of a drug affects its efficacy, safety, and utility in clinical practice. So Kefauver asked this question, well, what does the name matter to a series of experts in 1960? He gets many different answers. Now, what's he doing, right? Kefauver, like many others interested in the politics of consumerism in the early Kennedy years, see the branding practices of the drug industry as a brand-based monopoly by which brand names create a nation of what he calls captive consumers. You see this line here, the idea that wonder drug makers get handsome profit for their captive consumers. Now, drug consumers were captive in a number of different ways. One of them is that they had to consume what their doctors ordered. The other is that they often didn't even know what that drug was. So some of you may know, and I actually have another object to pass around. I'll pass around this prescription vial. This prescription vial from 1956, I think. And just take a quick look at it as it passes around. And thinking a little bit about this moment, the moment of the Kefauver investigation in the late 50s, early 60s. So Kefauver thought the generic name was a technology of consumer empowerment. It would make pharmaceuticals more like other consumer goods, like automobiles, grocery products, and washing machines, in which a consumer could compare goods and actually know what they're getting. Even if they didn't decide what medicine they'd be getting, they could actually still shop around and get a better price, for example. And it's hard to describe to this audience today in 2013 how revolutionary generic naming of drugs sounded to Americans in the early 1960s. Now, those of you who had a chance to look at that bottle, what might speculate, well, what's unusual about this bottle? This is a bottle for a prescription. It has a date. It has the name of a pharmacy. It has the name of a pharmacist. It has the name of a physician on it. And it has instructions on it, the name of a patient. But it doesn't have the name of the drug. It doesn't have the brand name or the generic name of the drug. The patient has no idea what drug they're taking. Now, doctors can and often did tell patients what drugs they were taking, but it was considered unethical for a pharmacist to actually list the generic name or even oftentimes the brand name of a drug on the vial itself. Now, of course, we would consider it today unethical for a pharmacist to omit such information. So it does remind us how ethics show different coherent moments of, we can call epistemological moments, ways of thinking that were coherent at that time. One of the reasons it was unethical for pharmacists to give generic names at this moment in time is because the placebo was still actively being used. And it was seen to actually undermine a key aspect of the therapeutic armamentarium to actually list it. So if you were to say, dextrose or sucrose, which I think those pills might be, although I haven't consumed one yet. Anyway, Kefauver wanted to do two radical things. He wanted to make sure patients knew the names of their drugs. He wanted to make sure they knew a rational, generic name of their drugs. And he wanted to ban the brand name and make the generic name the only possible name that drugs could be identified with on the marketplace. Now, he fails. This doesn't pass, and as we know, the Kefauver-Harris bill takes on a very different shape. But in the process, he mobilizes a lot of expertise and evidence. And there are many physicians that actually were on board with Kefauver's proposal, especially some self-avowed therapeutic rationalists like Cornell's Walter Modell, who thought that the rational language of generic names would create more rational physicians. And this, for the linguists out in the audience, this is actually a test of what's known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This idea that a more rational language might actually change the way that physicians thought, that language affected thought styles. If you make language more rational, you make doctors' prescribing behavior more rational as well. Now, Modell complained of the very small part that generic names, in comparison to brand names, played in medical education, oftentimes quite literally, and this is one of the exhibits that came up in the Kefauver exhibit. This is Singoserp, which is an advertisement for an antihypertensive agent, and those of you with good eyesight can make out that there is actually a generic name right here. It's Serosingapine. And there are fierce debates over the minimal font size and the relative difference in font size allowable between generic names and brands. This is kind of reflects linguistic politics that still take place in Quebec, for example, between English signage and French language signage. But we won't talk about that today. Modell thought brand names, quote, disguise as much as possible the nature of drugs, while generic names spoke about how drugs worked. The term generic, he said, means what it means. It shows the genus of the drugs, where it came from, what it's related to, what its heredity is, so to speak. Now, of course, not everybody agreed generic names were more rational. The pharmaceutical lobby, the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, its president, Austin Smith, testified in Kefauver's hearings in 1960 that generic terminology was actually less useful to prescribing physicians than brand names because it conveyed less information about a product than the brand name did. And his idea, and here's one pamphlet that they put out called Drugs Anonymous a little bit later in the decade, that generic names were not universal but useless, names that rendered drugs nameless or anonymous. When you're presented with a generic name for a drug as a physician or a pharmacist, you only know the chemical it contains. You don't know a number of other things that you know when you get a brand name. When you get a brand name, you know at least 3 more things about the drug. You know the pharmaceutical makeup, right? Is it an ointment, a tablet, a capsule, an elixir? You know the balance of ingredients, the binders and fillers, and you know that it was made in a quality-controlled environment of a reputable firm. And so they suggest that this is actually a more rational and more precise description of a drug product. Now, my research in the correspondence of early generic drug firms, and I've spent a bunch of time with material I've requested all correspondence between the FDA and a certain number of small generic firms from the 50s onwards. And it turns out most of these drugs most companies that become generic drug companies don't think of themselves as generic drug companies until the later 1960s. So at the time of Kefauver's investigations, these companies see themselves as ethical drug companies that just happen to have a less well-developed marketing arm. But what happens by the late 1960s is that these companies begin to think of themselves as being generic drug manufacturers. And so the industry itself really takes on an identity in the late 60s and the early 70s. And in doing so, they're fighting another appearance of the makers of copycat or follow-on drugs as being drug counterfeiters. And there's a lot of press, a lot of intrigue about drug counterfeiters, of people, basically making drugs in bathtubs and filthy working conditions. And there's a struggle for what becomes a generic drug industry to represent itself as a legitimate drug industry that actually makes quality products. And this comes up in a different set of congressional hearings. Wisconsin Senator Gaylord Nelson holds the hearings in the late 60s and throughout almost the entire 1970s on competitive problems in the drug industry. And he effectively introduces generic drugs as a category to the American consumer, as a novel solution to the inefficiencies of the pharmaceutical marketplace. As proof of this concept, Nelson describes how the Department of Defense buys drugs generically for Walter Reed Hospital, where Lyndon Johnson himself receives treatments. If generic drugs are good enough for the president, Nelson suggests, surely they would suffice for the average consumer. But again, as you would expect, there's a counterpart to this, and the political counterpart is mobilized quickly by the pharmaceutical industry, by the PMA specifically. And so Durward Hall, who's a representative from Missouri, a Republican, responds to Nelson's subcommittee that the president had never consumed generic drugs. And Hall denies the existence of generic drugs outright. He says, there is no such thing as generic drugs. I simply say to you, quote, anyone suggesting one drug firm is as good as another is a fool or naive or both. The military restricts its purchase to products of proven quality, not just generic drugs, but quality drugs made by companies they know and know well. The word generic implies anonymity, gentlemen. The program I have described to you is one emphasizing just the opposite. The result is that when the president goes to Walter Reed or Bethesda, he does not get generic drugs. He gets drugs made by companies the Defense Department knows supremely well. This is as it should be. And you see here again this politics of anonymity, what it means to not have a name. And this is actually a Reader's Digest supplement that was sponsored by the PMA through the late 60s and early 70s. An ailing man switched to a generic drug and landed in the hospital. And you see this concept of the generic drug is put in quotations as though the object itself does not actually exist. And this argument is made explicitly in other pamphlets and statements that all drugs are actually branded. It's just some are branded better than others. Some are branded by reputable companies. Others are branded by companies whose workplaces may look more like this. So how does this debate change over time? And again, what I'm trying to highlight is that by the late 1960s, there's a group of firms, and Primo is one of the first ones, and you have to love the names of these firms as well. It's been a really enjoyable project, work with companies like Primo Pharmaceutical, and Bolar, I should add, Bolar Pharmaceutical is founded in the late 50s by Robert Schulman and Larry Reisman, and the name is actually for Bob and Larry Pharmaceuticals, so it gets condensed into Bolar Pharmaceuticals. And so they are somewhat mom-and-pop bathtub operators. But here you see Primo by the late 60s is referring to itself as making generic products. And it's this idea of companies that say they're making generic drugs. PurePak, which becomes one of the biggest companies in generics in the early 1970s, calls itself, already by the mid-70s, I don't know if you can see it down here, the leading national brand of generic. And even in that phrase, the leading national brand of generic, one encounters some of the paradoxes of generic marketing. If marketing is a science of differentiation, and you're trying to sell something on the basis of its similarity, how does one market difference in a product of similarity, right? It quickly starts to hurt the brain. But here's one of their advertisements and shows some of the strategies of how one could begin to market the same thing differently, right? Here's PurePak generics are low-priced but not risky cheap. This idea that there's a level of cheapness, a threshold of cheapness that you don't want to go below, but if you get as close, asymptotic as possible to the quality cheap, and that is actually what a generic manufacturer of note and repute will do for you. It reminds me a little bit of the contemporary advertisements for Stella Artois, what I think is a middling European lager that has promoted itself with this phrase, reassuringly expensive. And again, between risky cheap and reassuringly expensive, we begin to see how generics can articulate sameness and difference very carefully. So one thing that's happening is that there is a shift in a number of state laws, right? And why are state laws beginning to reverse and permit substitution? Partly it's because state payers, Medicare and Medicaid, are now paying increasingly for drugs, and they are recognizing that there are laws in the books that get in the way of trying to prescribe the same for cheaper. There's also, of course, a technological moment. By the late 1960s, the wonder drugs of 1950 begin to go off patent, and this patent cliff marches forward. Some have talked about there being a second patent cliff, which is that there's one set of patents which is where when brand name drugs actually expire, and there's another in which the generic market expires. There's a sense of, if you take 17 years as this difference, one can understand that if there's a boom in post-war wonder drugs in the early 1950s, there's then a swell coming down the pipeline of newly off-patent drugs that are available for copying legally by the late 1960s. So there's a number of reasons we could talk about historically about why this happens at this moment in time. What I want to suggest, though, are some other curious forms of marketing same things differently that emerge already by the end of the 1960s, which is that far from just being small mom-and-pop firms, by 1970, the lion's share of generics are being sold by brand name companies. So SmithKline is one of the first to actually establish its own generics department, which it calls SK Line, in which it can brand its generics. So it makes SK or SmithKline versions of all of these generically available drugs. Letterly also is another dominant player. Letterly is a division of American Cyanamid. Letterly had been crucial to the development of a lot of broad-spectrum antibiotics in the 50s. But by the late 1960s and well underway by the early 70s, when you buy generics, take a look at Letterly standard products. And this idea was you can get cost savings without sacrificing a sense of reassuring quality you get with a brand name. But the brand name is the company and not the drug itself. Now, of course, most brand name companies, however, respond to the fear of generic substitution by questioning the ability of the Food and Drug Administration to actually guarantee quality. And this sets up a showdown, and here I would highlight, this is one of many advertisements that begins to appear in medical journals by the 1970s. You see, for added certainty, your patients get the high quality of Diaryl version of chlorothiazide, the original brand name version. Here's what we've done. We've put the name on the tablet for quick identification. Here's what you can do, specify no substitution. And so you see these kinds of battle lines being drawn, a showdown which lasts for several decades over whether and how the FDA can claim its ability to declare two drugs are or are not the same thing. whether, for example, the lack of a brand name etched into a tablet of a thiazide diuretic makes the drug non-exchangeable. Who gets to decide when a drug is effectively or functionally interchangeable? And this is a field that I call the science of similarity. And I'm only going to breeze through it. We can talk a little bit more about it in detail. I think the heart of the matter I want to emphasize is the problem of similarity. And what does similarity mean? Identicality means two things are the same in all possible respects. Similarity means things are the same in ways that matter. But the question then lies, well, who decides what matters, and how is that adjudicated? Generic drugs were never exactly the same as their brand name counterparts. Mostly, as you know, those of you who have consumed or had any success in handling generic drugs, they usually look quite different from the brand name versions. And some colleagues and I at the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology at the Brigham and Women's Hospital have done some studies on actually the impact that the changes in the appearance of a brand name drug, even when bioequivalent, has on adherence and on therapeutics. But even when generic drugs were exactly the same or mimicked as closely as possible their brand name versions, and here's a case of some generic lookalikes. If you look closely, even this Darvon, right, it's imitating the white and red bullet, but it's a little more tapered at the ends. Right? The curve isn't exactly the same. Similarly, but the difference between Librium and Accord's generic version of chlordiazepoxide, it's not actually exactly the same. The colors is slightly off. And so what I mean to suggest is that even when things are as close to as possible in all respects, they're never exactly the same. So they still differ in terms of the kinds of binders, dyes, and fillers. One of the reasons these still differ in these ways is that these things are trade secrets. So the patent is only on the active material itself, which means all the other ways of making the drug are protected, and the copying of those ways is done through reverse engineering and guesswork. So the question is, well, which of these things matter? And what I want to suggest, just flipping through these slides, is that there's a set of different sciences of similarity that emerged in the late 20th century. And if we look back at the way that pharmacopoeia is a technology that goes back into the early modern period, always contained ways of trying to prove a drug was what it was, mix it with a reagent, see if it turns color. We can quantify purity, we can establish identity, we can look at tablet uniformity. And one of the tests that was crucial was a test called disintegration testing, and still used as a wire basket that the drug is put in with water, and you see if it dissolves. And this was meant to get a sense of, well, how does the pill actually disperse itself? It's not enough to have the same amount of the same chemical in a pill if it doesn't dissolve in the human body. But a series of tests done in the 1950s with vitamins and with some antitubercular drugs begin to describe that even pills that pass this dissolution test, that actually dissolves to the same amount in water when shaken up, actually perform differently in the human body. There's a physiology of drug absorption. And this actually becomes the field of pharmacokinetics, which itself develops in the middle of this conflict. That one needs to study absorption, that absorption can differ, and that can really affect how drugs work. It's not enough just to talk about the physics and chemistry of the tablet. You also have to talk about the physiology of the tablet. And so there's some unusual early responses to this in the FDA and through the United States Pharmacopoeia. This is a machine that I don't think ever gained that much popularity, but you can see the kinds of responses that were taken. Well, can we reproduce the human gut in the laboratory in a way so that rather than just putting a pill in a bucket of water, we can actually create a specialized hand-blown glass that simulates the gastric rugae and the intestinal plicae. They hooked it up to a set of standardized juices, so you would turn on what was called a peristaltic pump, and it would sort of squirt in like rhythmic waves a bunch of gastric juice through the ring, and then you would take that out and you would replace it with intestinal solution. Then you'd see how much of the pill is left. But even this was not actually seen to be quite accurate enough, and eventually gives way to what this field we now know as bioavailability and bioequivalence. And this is a more in vivo. This is abandoning the ability of trying to do the regulation purely in the laboratory and actually looking at what we call the area under the curve here. If you take a drug like tolbutamide and a hypoglycemic, a diabetic medication, here's volunteers, here's the amount of hours after the dose, here's how much serum tolbutamide can be measured at various points. But as you begin to think about it, running an operation in which you can get a sufficient amount of human volunteers to consume this drug and have regular blood draws is going to be much more expensive than actually just setting up even even paying a glass blower to make that unusually shaped ring, let alone just having a wire basket and a bit of water. And so what we see here is as these sciences of similarity unfold, each one is more precise and can claim higher precision, but each one also comes with a higher price tag, and that thus acts as a paradoxical, both a regulatory barrier and also a price check. It becomes harder to make generic drugs cheaper if you have to pass all of these barriers of equivalence testing. And one of the questions that kept on being asked in the debates over these sciences of similarity is, well, is this really necessary? I mean, there's a handful of drugs that are relatively insoluble in water and that have a narrow therapeutic window for which it's actually quite important to know how it behaves on a curve like this. But the bulk of the pharmacopoeia, actually, this kind of data probably doesn't even matter that much at all. So even so, there's a different set of factors suggesting that not that bioequivalence is overkill for most drugs, but that bioequivalence is insufficient, that it doesn't matter how good your testing is, any company can be fraudulent. And this is a set of ads that Eli Lilly put forward in the late 70s. I think they're genius ads. The one the patient takes is never tested. And the idea is, sure, you can have any degree, you can have precise bioequivalence data testing, but that's only valid for the point in time and the samples on which those tests are drawn. You still have to have trust. And who are you going to trust? How can you actually regulate trustworthiness in an organization? And of course, given the example that I started the talk with, Lilly clearly did have a point, right? So this is not an unreasonable argument, but it clearly is an interested point. It clearly, in the battles over similarity and difference, Lilly's point is an interested point intended to get physicians to continue using brand name drugs. Lilly actually supported its point with a different kind of science of similarity and difference, in which it looked at frequency of recalls by the FDA between brand name firms and generic firms, and showed, unfortunately, the color hasn't turned out very well here, but you see this red line, this is incident of recalls in generic firms, in brand name firms, this is incident in spikes in recalls in generic firms, and they try and make other arguments that there's a way of quantifying the reputation of different firms, which should lead one to trust brands versus generics. Now, there's a different set of sciences of similarity that are also invoked, and these are managerial sciences of similarity, the science of quality assurance and quality control. And the graph I'm showing you here is from Walter Schuhart, who's a famous pioneer of the fields of quality control sciences working at Bell Labs in the 30s. And Schuhart was interested in transistors. And as he points out, that if you look at a factory that makes transistors, you're going to find that all of them are going to have a slight variation in their resistance, for example, and they're never going to be exactly the same. The task of a company is not to guarantee identicality, but to set some barriers, a minimal threshold, a maximal threshold, so that variations that are inevitable in products are going to lie within a window that's acceptable. And what I want to suggest here is what you see between these brand and generic divisions. Not only is it not just a transition from moving from the physics and chemistry of an old pharmacopoeia to this new biological test of bioequivalence that solves all problems, it's actually a multitude of different scientific forms, different ways of trying to prove difference and similarity. One of the interesting things, though, is that bioavailability curve I showed you, now that was a science of proving difference that Upjohn actually developed to demonstrate that generic competitors were going to be inferior to its branded version of tolbutamide, Oronase. But once it's established as a legitimate form of critique, it becomes the basis for a regulatory science the FDA uses to come up with a regulatory threshold so that generic drugs can legitimately compete. There's a dynamic cat and mouse quality to these rules in which anytime an argument, a science of difference, is made legitimate, it can then turn into a regulatory science of similarity. This happens with GMPs as well. There's a cat and mouse between firms claiming that only the quality control that they are able to maintain in their own firms is going to guarantee similarity of products and trustworthiness. But then those criteria can be adopted by FDA regulators in the field and adopted as national public thresholds as well. So there's always this kind of space in between private and public regulation of quality. Now, in the Q&A, hopefully we'll have some time to get a bit more to how this is playing out today in real time in ways that I'm struggling to keep up with new sciences of similarity developing in large molecule follow-on products, the problem of the biosimilar, the biocomparable, what it means to copy a large molecule where you actually, unlike a small molecule like tolbutamide, you actually don't know the chemical structure, the exact placement of all the atoms. So how can one actually claim to make the same product when a biotech product goes off patent. And these are problems that really have just started to actually kick into a material sense just this past fall with the approval of tivograstim, for example. Now, I want to bring this to a close by talking about what I call the generic future. In recent years, as we mentioned before, generics have become a dominant aspect of the U.S. market, but not just the U.S. market, also the global drug market. And as the global drug market has become more generic, generics themselves have become more global as entities. And this might seem like a sophistry or a truism, but it means different things at both ends. So I'd like to mention briefly Teva, which is the definition of the generic giant today. Really just one of many. David has become Goliath by the early 21st century. The small firms that sold by generic name in 1960 are now global giants. Teva, from a May 2010 report, is one of the largest drug companies in the world. It's the largest if you look at certain measures of volume. It's no longer a little pharma. And here's how Teva represents its own global spread. There's 1.5 million Teva prescriptions per day filled in the U.S. alone. That's 1 out of every 7 prescriptions filled in United States pharmacies are filled by one company, Teva. In Asia, there's a very, very good penetration as well. Former Soviets, South Africa, and Europe in 29 member states. The stat I got last month was that 1,186 doses of Teva pharmaceuticals were taken by patients in Europe every second. So Teva is the largest generic company in the world. It is also, at this point, in its own way, a branded company. Here you see an ad on their website. Perhaps you're noticing something different about your Teva product, and the difference is that they now are adding, blurrily here, adding the Teva name to it. So that this is in some ways a return to an older institutional concept of pharmaceutical branding, where it's the house, the firm, that actually is branded rather than the actual chemicals themselves. Here's a New York Times article recently. Teva leads the U.S. market in overall prescriptions. And what I would want to point out here is that it's not just Teva. If you look at this, 6 of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies by U.S. prescriptions in 2009 are manufacturers of generic drugs, and including some former brand name research firms. So that when they mention Novartis here, part of this is Sandoz. And as you know, Novartis is formed by the merger of the 2 Swiss giants, Ciba and Sandoz. And they merge into Novartis. And then cunningly, Sandoz reemerges Phoenix-like from this combined company as, at that point, the world's largest branded generic drug manufacturer. Some other firms are responding to this generic menace, which they perceive with a new strategy of authorized generics, which is that a brand name drug going off patent can sell the trade secrets beyond the active chemical. Remember, the color, the binders, the fillers, the degree of stamping. As one of many strategies by which brand name companies are trying to remain competitive in an increasingly generic future. Others are responding by staking out terrains around this new world of biosimilarity, which really is still just emerging. It looks like it's going to be hard for generic companies to compete competitively on price in the biosimilars arena, because it's going to cost a lot more to prove biocomparability. I think I'll end here with this contemporary environment we're in of the new spate of approvals and anticipated approvals of biosimilar products. And I want you to consider the story of biosimilarity from this perspective. Recent developments in the innovative structure of the pharmaceutical industry that extend prior logics of similarity in unorthodox ways are perhaps uncomfortable for existing standards of regulation, marketing, practice, and consumption. These produce new market opportunities, new crises of confidence for physicians, pharmacists, and consumers. The scenario demands new regulatory practices of comparability, interchangeability, and exchangeability that are highly geographically variable and expose discontinuities in many different ways to make things the same. The European Medical Authority has come up with very different ways of regulating biosimilars compared to the FDA, for example. And these arguments expose the insufficiency of our current structures for detecting significant differences between objects we would like to call the same, and demand novel suites of sciences of similarity. At the end of the day, there are debates open even what these things are and what we should even call them or name them. Are they biosimilars? Are they biocomparables? Are they follow-on biological drugs? We don't even know what to name such things. Should a biosimilar drug get the same generic name as the brand name version, or does it need to be called something different? And what I'd like to suggest is, just in this brief narrative of biosimilars, we've actually rolled backwards theme by theme through the entire talk that I've just given, the whole history I've given today. We see the redeployment of structures and forces of similarity in medicine, and I want to point out that the story of biosimilars in the 21st century is not the same as the story of small molecule generics in the 1960s and 70s, but it is similar. It is a similar story. It is the same but not the same. And the same but not the same is a useful way of understanding the valence of historical critique in health policy and in health knowledge practices in general. It's not true, as Santayana is so often overquoted, that those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it, because we never actually repeat the past. What returns is not quite the same as what came before. It's only similar. And as I want to suggest, attending to these laws of similarity is the task of the historian, and attempting to define from our prior experience what is relevant to understanding the returning forces in the present. Thanks much for your attention today.
So we have time for a few questions.
Yes.
If it's not too much of a digression, I wonder if you can comment on the recent case in India which dealt with whether patent protection can protect a brand company from just incremental changes to their basic drug, or whether those drugs should be allowed to go.
Sure. Are you talking about Dr. Reddy versus Pfizer?
I think was Novartis.
The Gleevec case. Okay. Well, I mean, I'm familiar with Reddy versus Pfizer. I'm not familiar with the Gleevec case, and I'd love to hear more about it. Maybe we can chat more about it afterwards. But certainly, those who have commented, many people who have commented on biosimilarities have brought up Reddy versus Pfizer as a way of understanding how you can have slight differences in amlodipine, for example, right? Amlodipine was on patent, calcium channel blocker, but differences in the salt, right? Amlodipine maleate versus amlodipine bersilicate offered incremental differences, and there was a question of what these incremental differences mean in terms of patent protection. And many have looked to that decision as a way of jurisprudence moving forward in this area.
Yeah, I mean, one of the drug company arguments was that if you take away these protections, they're just going to reduce innovation and R&D and all that kind of stuff. And the opposite argument is that they spend all this time developing incremental differences and not actually developing new and innovative products. It's kind of a
yes, I agree. And I think there's two ways to answer that question. I'd love to chat with you more about the case. One is that part of the challenge, part of the legal challenge for bio as a lobbying group, right, the biotech lobbying group versus PMA or pharma, is this real question that that almost any follow-on biological drug, because it's not going to be exactly the same chemically, could be considered to be a different drug and therefore patentable in its own right. And this is one of these problems, that in a way the patent regime that governs a product as a knowable structural chemical is very helpful in the realm of small molecule therapeutics. It becomes much more tangled when you say, well, if what someone else is going to make is not going to be the same chemical, well, one of the challenges then is it's harder to prove similarity, but one of the benefits then is that almost anyone can make a knockoff drug and claim it's a different thing. And so the patenting structures to protect biotech drugs have been much more complicated, and they've been challenged in some very interesting ways. The other way of getting to that is to actually look at the question of Me Too drugs. And I do think that there's a whole section of the book I'm writing about generics and Me Too drugs, which I cut out of this talk. But I think it's a fascinating question. In some ways, the generic becomes the alternative that implicitly critiques the redundancy or the triviality of the innovation of Me Too drugs. And so to the extent that there is a generic as a cheaper alternative within a therapeutic class, a trivially different drug posing as innovation, generic becomes in a way of distinguishing or outing true innovation versus false innovation. And there's a graph I wanted to show, which some of you have undoubtedly seen. This is Scannell and et al. This is a graph from early last year from Nature Drug Discovery. And this is one of many studies of what's called the crisis in innovation, this idea that the pharmaceutical industry has really lost and has really run out of steam. And you see here a historical argument between 1950 and 2010. What's on the y-axis here is number of drugs approved by the FDA per billions of dollars in U.S. R&D spending. And the implicit rhetorical argument that this graph makes is that the productivity of the drug industry has been declining continuously at almost the same rate throughout, and that changes in regulation, supposedly the FDA regulation which produced the drug lag, the PDUFA, the emergence of biotech has not altered this at all. And we've gone below this threshold of 1, right, in which now you get less than 1 drug per $1 billion spent. Now, the authors here blame generic drugs, which is quite fascinating. And they make this argument called the better than the Beatles problem, and you can probably read this as well as I can. They say, imagine how hard it would be to achieve commercial success with new pop songs if any new song had to be better than the Beatles, if the entire Beatles catalog was available for free, and if people did not get bored with old Beatles records. And the point they're making here is implicitly your argument, right? Which is that the existence of a generic drug that is functional within a class provides a test as to whether an innovation is actually truly significant or not, which makes it iteratively harder to actually get a drug passed over time. Sorry, that was a lengthy answer. Other questions? Yes, Caleb.
That was a great talk, and I'm thinking with my clinical hat about kind of having to simplify things, and one of the things you've done is, I think, shown some of the nuance of the issues with respect to, similar but not the same. Are there empiric studies summarizing the evidence for the bioequivalence of generic and generic and branded drugs?
Yes.
And I just wondered if you could speak to that, and also maybe just the lay public perception, which has been long-standing, at least, sort of that generics are inferior, and one could see a little bit how that might come out from some of the comments that you made.
Certainly, and I think I appreciate the question, and there are other slides I could have listed of different sciences of similarity. One of them being meta-analysis, right? Another one being epidemiology, and Brian Strom has been doing some work on trying to put forward how you can do responsible pharmacoepidemiologic studies. Josh Gagne at Harvard of comparing brands and generics, and Josh has specifically been doing work in the field of epileptics, anti-epileptic research. So to sum up the two of them, I mean, Aaron Kesselheim and others at the Brigham published some, I think, quite important meta-analyses of cardiovascular drugs, showing that, broadly speaking, the data is there's very good data if you actually, there's meta-analyses you run suggesting that brands and generic drugs perform equivalently. And here's another way of forming a proof, which kind of counters Lilly's, 1970s graph. And of course, the field of anti-epileptics is one in which generic equivalence has been challenged the most repeatedly, and in several states, substitution laws have been reversed, so the anti-epileptic drugs are actually not substitutable. Josh Gagne, who's a brilliant young pharmacoepidemiologist at the Brigham, had done some studies showing that the epidemiologic studies that try to prove difference are actually severely flawed, and he's published a series of critiques of this. But in other words, here's a way in which, as new sciences of similarity are recruited, they can actually produce difference or similarity, and we'd like to think of them as objective, right? And yet Josh has pointed out ways in which the kinds of epidemiological studies that have documented anti-epileptic difference and actually caused a force in legislative change is deeply methodologically flawed. Now, personally, as a physician, I prescribe generics all the time. I consume generics personally unless I'm consuming ibuprofen, and I will pay a few extra cents per pill to consume the beautifully sugar-coated lentil discs of Advil because I believe they make my migraine go away faster, entirely on a placebo basis. But I wouldn't want to leave an audience with an impression that I question the utility of generic drugs right now. And in other words, what I'm trying to do is expose a set of conflicts that were very prominent in the 1970s, 1960s, and have largely in the field of generics been settled. And I think one of the reasons I started out with Hatch-Waxman was to suggest that, once you have bioequivalence settled as a threshold for ANDA, there's a robust body of data behind the fact that there is no compelling scientific basis of inequivalence. The only problem that persists after Hatch-Waxman is that governance, that without good governance, none of these regulatory pathways, no regulatory pathway means anything unless it's actually matched with good governance. But I believe that we have had that in the FDA for the past few decades. But the reason I try and play out this debate as an active debate rather than one that we have moved past is that I think that if we open up that debate, we see the contemporary problems we have over trying to legislate similarity in the fields of biopharmaceutics. And even more so, I think we see the kinds of problems we have in resistance to therapeutic substitution. So resistance to the substitution of a generic statin for ceruvastatin, for example. And so it's important as a historian to open that debate up, even though as a clinician, I really want it to be shut. Yeah.
Yeah, this is sort of an aside as far as atorvastatin that came out, and shortly afterwards, the generic was recalled because there was glass in it, but that wasn't widely made available to people who were taking it. So do they also inspect?
So yes, and I think that there's a much broader conversation we could have about the complexities of managing quality control in a increasingly deep and actually obscured supply chain of pharmaceutical production. Right, as we know, global pharmaceutical production has become more and more globalized. We know that we know very little about the satisfactory pathways of assessing the quality of drug products from bit to bit. And FDA officials have talked quite a bit about this problem and how the FDA is working to ramp up capacity and how it can actually have people inspecting plants in other parts of the world. What's interesting though is that when the cases have come up, and you mentioned atorvastatin, but before the Glass and Lipitor, the most prominent case was tainted heparin coming out of Chinese plants, and many commentators used this tainted heparin as another example of why one should beat the drum of the case against generic drugs and only trust brand name drugs. But the actual truth of that case was that heparin, that supply chain, fed into Bayer. And so most of the tainted heparin product actually was a branded product. And so one of the problems we have is that when one casts suspicion and navigates a distance between producer and supplier, it becomes a way of adding to a critique of anonymity. And yet that critique applies equally to the branded drugs as to generic drugs. But certainly, anytime it comes up as another reason not to trust generics. Which goes back to Caleb's argument that there's a powerful set of psychological barriers to physicians feeling comfortable with generics and to consumers feeling comfortable with generics. My colleague Ann Pollack has written about a racial politics of generic drugs where in the 1990s, when recommendations suggested that African Americans should be taking generic thiazides for their hypertension as a first step, while white Americans should be taking brand name calcium channel blockers, that this quickly fed into a sense of racial difference that, oh, this is because blacks should get the cheaper, older medicines, while whites should get the newer, fancier stuff. And it sounds like I'm glossing a kind of a ridiculous argument, but it actually was not ridiculous at all, and it became a very, very active bit of lobbying between minority health groups. And so I just want to suggest that the politics of generic consumption we didn't really touch on at all in this talk, and it's a fascinating set of stories which continues to be a problem today.
Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks again.